It was so massively popular, it helped make Kids WB the top-rated network kids block, as well as turning it into a must-watch one. And along with Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z finding newfound success on cable, gave anime the major push into mainstream popularity. And also, but more sadly, the original Pokémania phenomenon had begun to wane. Suffice to say, except for the die-hard fans, many now saw Pokémon as a passing fad. Of the many network kids blocks that were created during the mid to late 90s, there were few that defined a generation more than Kids WB. From its premiere on September 9, 1995, the block would house many shows, including some that were brought over from Fox Kids, that one couldn't find or get from the other big networks. And over the next several years, it would build a sizable and respectable audience that could compete with the other network Saturday morning blocks. However, it wouldn't be until February 13, 1999, when the block premiered a little-known anime they acquired from syndication, that it would become a force to be reckoned with. That anime was Pokémon, and for the next 7 years, both the show and the block would enjoy a tremendous amount of success and popularity. But then, in late summer of 2006, after 7 successful seasons, Pokémon was taken off the block's schedule. So, what exactly happened that led to the decision? After all, it does seem rather bizarre that Kids WB would seemingly drop the show out of nowhere, especially after all the success it brought to the block. Well, today we're gonna find out all about that and more. So with all that, I'm the Media Nutso, and it's high time we take a deep look back at Pokémon's time on Kids WB. Of course, before we get things going proper, we first need to see how the anime first started off and how it eventually came over to the United States. It first began in Japan on April 1st, 1997, when the Pokémon anime, based on the popular Pokémon Red, Green, and Blue video games, made its premiere on TV Tokyo. Initially overseen by head writer and showrunner, the late Takeshi Shudo, the series centered on the main character Satoshi, Ash Ketchum in the English dub, as he sets out on his journey to become the world's greatest Pokémon master. The series would quickly become, no exaggeration, a tremendous, phenomenal, and cultural success. And I do mean cultural. Over 25 years on, having weathered various incidents and scandals at certain points, both the show and the franchise have firmly ingrained themselves as a Japanese fixture and staple that's still going strong to this very day. So, with how hugely successful the show had become, plans were soon made to bring the series over to the United States and see if they could replicate that success. Ultimately, 4Kids Productions would be the company given the license to dub the series, which ended up being quite a lucky break for them, thanks to 4Kids Entertainment being the licensing agent for Nintendo of America, which had started back when they were originally Leisure Concepts Inc. in 1987. At the time, 4Kids Productions was a relatively new production subsidiary of the larger 4Kids Entertainment, and did see some early success with their first show, WMAC Masters, in 1995. However, that show ended up getting cancelled after 2 seasons due to it being too expensive to produce. Now, we all know that the anime would go on to make a home on Kids WB, but what few remember is that the show actually first began in syndication. For those unaware of how syndication works, basically, instead of airing on a single network like CBS or ABC, a show is instead sold directly to various independent television stations across the country. In the case of Pokémon, despite a lot of initial reluctance, it was eventually sold to 112 stations, which were various WB, Fox, and UPN affiliates across the country, clearing about 85 to 90% of households. Also, the time it would air on those stations would vary depending on where you lived.
Pokémon! Weekdays at 6:30 on Crew 62.
Pokémon, weekday mornings at 6:30 on Fox 43.
But even before it premiered, despite its huge success in Japan, there was a lot of doubt if the show would actually be successful in the US, especially after it received negative feedback and market research. Plus, at the time, anime hadn't quite hit mainstream popularity yet. Oh sure, there were some anime that were well known like Astro Boy, Kimba the White Lion, Speed Racer, and Gigantor, but for the most part, it was largely a niche market. What didn't help either was that the show was originally placed in some pretty weak time slots, like around 6 to 8 o'clock in the morning or in the early afternoon, when the target audience would be waking up and getting ready for, would already be at, or just getting off from school. Just to put this further in context, Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z had premiered in syndication in 1995 and 1996 respectively in similar time slots, and both shows ended up not doing very well. Despite these doubts and setbacks, plus being backed by an aggressive marketing campaign which included a sneak peek VHS, and of course the famous slogan, "Gotta catch 'em all," when the anime officially premiered on September 7th, 1998 with a special version of the 15th episode, Battle Aboard the St. Dan, and then properly began with the first episode the next day, it would prove every person who doubted the show wrong, as it quickly became a massive hit, which at the time was quite a rare achievement for an anime premiering in the US. In fact, by December of that year, Pokémon was the highest rated children's show in syndication. The show would air its first 40 episodes during that time, but would then stop on October 30th with the episode March of the Executor Squad. But it wasn't for the reasons you might think. Because of how hugely successful it was, it got the attention of Warner Brothers and Fox Family worldwide, who both wanted to bring the show to their respective network kids blocks. A heated bidding war ensued, and eventually Warner would win the bid and bring the show over to Kids WB. However, it wasn't exactly all straightforward. While Kids WB would get to air the newer episodes, the stations that still had licenses with the show were allowed to continue rerunning the first 40 episodes until they expired in September of 1999. When Pokémon finally premiered on Kids WB 4 months later on February 13th, 1999 with the episode The Problem with Paris, to say it had a strong start would be a massive understatement.
Hurry, it's spreading!
Squirtle, Squirtle. Pikachu! This is the 20th case of Pokemon fever this week!
It's unstoppable!
Coffee!
It was a gigantic start. Thanks to its momentum from syndication, the episode would become the highest rated premiere in Kids WB's history, with a 3.9 rating and 15 share, and it would only continue growing from there. By September of that year, it was averaging an audience of 1.6 million viewers, and at one point it attracted 3.1 million, making it the largest audience Kids WB would ever receive. It was so massively popular, it helped make Kids WB the top-rated network kids block, as well as turning it into a must-watch one. And along with Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z finding newfound success on cable, gave anime the major push into mainstream popularity. Of course, their success would not go unnoticed. After failing to buy the show, Fox Kids responded by acquiring other anime that were similar to Pokémon. There was Digimon, which did become a big success for that block, to the point of even beating Pokémon a couple of times, and they also got Monster Ranchers, Metabots, and Flip the Time Detective, all of which yielded mixed results. But it didn't all stop there. The anime's success had become so widespread and well known, it would get parodied on some episodes of several notable shows, including The Norm Show, South Park, and of course, The Simpsons. That alone shows just how big the anime had made it. The anime's popularity would also help it hold the #1 spot on Saturday mornings for 54 straight weeks. However, this streak wouldn't last forever. As I previously brought up in my One Saturday Morning video, Pokémon was briefly dethroned from the #1 spot by Disney's The Weekenders in May of 2000. This was such a big deal that TV Guide dubbed The Weekenders the show that killed Pokémon. But like I've said, that victory was short-lived and the anime would shortly reclaim the #1 spot. Also, as I mentioned earlier, Digimon would beat Pokémon a couple of times during its run. The anime's success also led to Warner Bros. Acquiring the distribution rights to the theatrical Pokémon movies, with the first one, Pokémon the First Movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back, releasing on November 10, 1999, which was far from a critical darling, but was a great success at the box office, grossing $85.7 million domestically and $163.6 million worldwide, making it, at the time, the highest grossing anime film in America. Then, the next year came Pokémon the Movie 2000, The Power of One on July 21st, 2000, which did slightly better critically, though not by much, and grossed $43 million in the US. Just a little over half of what the first film made, but was still a success nonetheless with a worldwide gross of $133.9 million. After that came Pokémon 3 the Movie Spell of the Unknown on April 6, 2001, and it would be the least successful of the first three films, only grossing $17 million in the US and $68.4 million worldwide, but it was also the best reviewed of the first three movies, though again, not by a lot. Now, as great as it was that Pokémon brought a lot of success to kids WB, it was also a double-edged sword. What exactly did I mean by that? Well, Pokémon's success began to come at the expense of Warner Bros.' other shows. See, for the kids WB executives, Pokémon created a specific precedent for them: more low-cost shows that could bring in gangbuster ratings. Suddenly, they began to give many of their own shows the short end of the stick. For instance, Batman Beyond was planned to have a third season, but that ended up getting cancelled. Static Shock got cut short after its fourth season, despite that show consistently pulling in good ratings, and R.L. Stein's The Nightmare Room and The Zeta Project were cancelled after 1 and 2 seasons respectively. As you might imagine, it was pretty disheartening for the people that were working on those shows. That being said though, this is not to say every new Warner Bros. Animated show got this treatment, nor did any good emerge from it. During that time, Kids WB would acquire more anime: Cardcaptors, Yu-Gi-Oh!, which became another massive hit for the block, Astro Boy 2003, and Mega Man NT Warrior. Plus, Warner Bros. Animation would get more big hit shows of their own on the block, including but not limited to Shaolin Showdown, Mucha Lucha, What's New Scooby-Doo, and Teen Titans. So yeah, Pokémon's popularity on the block brought a lot of positive and negative effects, but this can pretty much apply to any big show on any block or network, and it's also not difficult to see why they lean so hard into it. Anywho, 2001 was a year that saw big changes for the anime. At this point in its run, the show had moved right into the second generation with the Johto saga. And also, but more sadly, the original Pokémania phenomenon had begun to wane. Just to be clear, this doesn't mean the show and the franchise as a whole was suddenly unpopular, just that it was no longer the hot commodity people were going crazy about. Merchandise sales and profits dropped a staggering 74%, and there were other big shows and movies, including but not limited to SpongeBob SquarePants, Star Wars, and Yu-Gi-Oh! That took a large amount of their shares both in ratings and merchandise sales. Also, after the third movie underperformed at the box office, Warner Bros. Sold the film distribution rights to Miramax, who would go on to release the next 4 movies, starting with Pokémon Forever. Suffice to say, except for the die-hard fans, many now saw Pokémon as a passing fad, to the point where 2002 was cited as when the last bit of Pokémania officially died off. All of that being said though, not being a phenomenon anymore doesn't mean the anime stopped being popular. In fact, from 2001 to 2003, though it would steadily lose ad revenue, the show continued to perform well, ranking at the top of the Saturday morning ratings for a little while longer and maintained a loyal fan base from there on out. Also, during that time, the North American branch of the Pokémon Company, Pokémon USA, now the Pokémon Company International, was founded to manage and regulate the franchise in the US, with one of the first deals they made being a 5-year agreement with 4Kids that allowed them to continue dubbing the anime for 4 years, as well as handling the licensing and merchandising of the show, and even giving them a 3% stake in the company for an undisclosed amount. As the show moved into the 3rd generation in 2003 with Pokémon Advanced, though its ratings continued to thin out and weren't quite as big as they were back in 1999 and 2000, it would still consistently rank in the top 10 Saturday morning broadcasts. On a side note, on March 15, 2003, to coincide with the American release of Ruby and Sapphire, Kids WB aired a sneak preview version of the first 2 episodes of Pokémon Advanced, much like what had been done with Battle Aboard the St. Dan 5 years earlier. But unlike that episode, where the only major differences were the narrations at the start and the end of the episode, there would only be some grammatical corrections made to 2 of May's lines for both episodes in the time between the preview and official premiere. They would also be the only episodes of Pokémon Advanced 4Kids recorded at Taj, as by the time the season premiered, production had been moved to 4Kids in-house facilities. So of course, they went back and re-recorded both episodes. Anyways, getting back to the main topic, even if the show wasn't quite the big draw it once was, every now and again they would score some big victories. A prime example of this, in 2005, Kids WB would see the broadcast premiere of the 7th Pokémon movie, Destiny Deoxys, and it would go on to deliver the best ratings Kids WB had seen from the show since 2003. Showing that Pokémon still have plenty of power to draw in audiences. Speaking of, though the anime movies were no longer huge box office hits in the US, they did quite well in home media sales, and after the distribution rights were picked up by Viz Media beginning with Lucario and the Mystery of Mew, they would go on to be a fixture of the market for the next decade. Also during that time, 4Kids produced a spin-off series, Pokémon Chronicles, where they dubbed and packaged together the side story specials that first aired on the weekly Pokémon broadcasting station, the Legend of Thunder special, and some shorts from the Pikachu's Winter Vacation series. The show first aired on Toonami UK from May 11th to October 5th, 2005, and in the US on Cartoon Network from June 6th to November 25th, 2006 for a total of 22 episodes, making it the only Pokémon-related series to not air on Kids WB. Well, we've now reached the point of the video I'm sure you've all been waiting for. The moment we finally answer the big question. Why exactly did Kids WB drop Pokémon from the block? Well, it wasn't the result of just one factor, but several of them. To fully understand what exactly happened, we need to lay out the events that eventually led up to the decision, namely the dub going through a major recasting and Kids WB's move to another network. By late 2005, despite the anime continuing to do well in the ratings, its popularity was no longer translating into big money. Now granted, as I mentioned earlier, profits had been steadily declining for some time, but 4Kids and Pokémon USA were able to make do with it. However, it had now reached the point where it was no longer good enough for either party. So, in October of 2005, 4Kids liquidated their 3% stake in Pokémon USA and sold it back to Nintendo, Creatures Inc., and Game Freak for $960,000. Which for them was really no big loss, as they had already made a profit of over $140 million from the franchise. Then, 2 months later on December 23rd, 4Kids and Pokémon USA announced they were not going to renew their agreement deal, which would expire 8 days later on New Year's Eve, and that beginning in 2006, Pokémon USA would handle the licensing through their in-house group, though 4Kids would continue to receive commissions on the payments made under the agreement, though in shrinking increments over the next few years. Following afterwards, Pokémon USA began scouting for a different company that could produce the dub for a lower cost. 4Kids put up their bid for the job, though likely only out of obligation, and were ultimately outbid by Taj Productions. Now, Taj had previously assisted 4Kids on producing the dub years before, being where 4Kids recorded the show from the second half of the Indigo League up until near the end of Master Quest, when they switched over to their in-house facilities for the remainder of their tenure. So, once Advanced Battle nearly wrapped up production, Pokémon USA planned to move production of the English dub in-house. And as part of an effort to lower production costs, they were going to hire an entirely new voice cast to voice the characters, who were cast based on who was the best at replicating each of the characters' distinct voices. But some veteran cast members did make the jump over, namely James Cathcart and Casey Rogers. They were even able to bring Roger Parsons back to reprise his role as the narrator, after having been replaced by Mike Pollitt partway into Advanced. As for the new cast members, they hired Michelle Knotts, Bill Rogers, and much later on, Sarah Notochetti. To give the new cast a trial run, Pokémon USA commissioned an hour-long TV special that was also meant to commemorate the franchise's 10th anniversary, The Mastermind of Mirage Pokémon, and the dub for it was produced rather quickly, as it only took them 3 weeks to dub the whole special. However, just before the special premiered, news about the cast change began to spread through the fandom, and after it was confirmed by the original cast members that it was happening, many fans were none too happy to hear this. But there were some that were open to giving the new cast a fair shot. When the special premiered on Saturday, April 29, 2006, many absolutely despised it, mainly for the new cast performances as the characters, though the few fans that gave the special a fair shot thought that it was a decent special in its own right. The fan backlash had gotten so huge, as part of an effort to persuade Pokémon USA to reinstate the original cast, a fan movement was started called Save Our Voice Actors, which the effort ultimately didn't amount to much. However, while they would move forward with the cast change, that didn't mean Pokémon USA wasn't listening to the feedback. On the contrary, they did. In fact, 2 big changes came out of it. At the 2006 Comic-Con International, they announced that Casey Rogers, who was the original choice to take over as Ash as well as Max, was switched to then newcomer Sarah Notochetti, and that they would go back and redub the whole special, which would later air on Cartoon Network and be released on DVD as part of the special 2-disc edition of Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. Now, before we continue on, we should address one question that's lingered ever since the recast happened. Why didn't Pokémon USA just simply bring the original cast on board in the first place? Well, the official reason given is, on top of lowering costs, it was because the original cast was contractually tied with 4Kids and thus weren't allowed on any productions outside of the company. Well, this is only a half-truth. According to some of them, their contracts didn't have any sort of non-compete exclusivity clauses or any other kind of unimpeachable terms. They did, however, have a sunset clause, which forbade them from continuing to voice any of the characters they did at 4Kids for another company for a certain amount of time, which was for 1 year. The purpose of this clause was to ensure none of the character voices would be exploited away from 4Kids. Now, I'm sure many of you right now may be asking the reasonable question, why didn't Pokémon USA just wait for that clause to expire and then bring the cast over? Full disclosure, what I'm about to say next is purely an educated guess based around all of the information that I've presented to you. So, if I turn out to be wrong on this, I sincerely apologize in advance. Anyways, Pokémon USA made this decision not just to save on money, but also to save on time. Now, what do I specifically mean by that? You see, once they assumed production, Pokémon USA had one long-term plan for the dub going forward, to not have it be too far behind the original Japanese airings. So they wanted to get going on the next season of the show as soon as possible. Ergo, had they decided to wait for that sunset clause to expire, it would have ended up pushing the dub further behind the Japanese version. To give an idea of what would have happened from there, It would have been like how 4Kids skipped the final season of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX so they could get straight to Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. And I don't think many fans would have been too happy about that. Thus, for Pokémon USA, it was simpler and easier to just switch to a different cast. It also would have been pretty jarring for the dub to abruptly switch voice actors in the middle of an ongoing series had they done it later on. To sum up, there weren't any personal vendettas or grudges against the original actors on Pokémon USA's end. It was just to both increase the dub's profitability and to ensure its longevity in the US. Now, could they have done all of this without coming off like they were burning bridges? Yes, they could have. But you know, hindsight is 2020. Alrighty then, back onto the main story. On Kids WB's end, they weren't too happy with how the mastermind of Mirage Pokémon turned out. However, at that same time, they were going through their own round of changes. On December 30th, 2005, at the behest of their station affiliates, the WB would officially end the weekday afternoon Kids WB block, and would be replaced by the more adult-oriented daytime WB on January 2nd, 2006. As a result, Kids WB would be just a Saturday morning block for the rest of its time, though it was extended by 1 hour starting on January 6th. Not long after that, on January 24th, it was announced that due to both struggling and stagnant ratings and profitability, both the WB and UPN networks would be merged into one network, the CW, which would launch on September 18th, 2006. And since Kids WB was one of the WB network's strongest assets, coupled with the fact that UPN hadn't had its own children's block since Disney's 1-2 was cancelled in 2003, it was elected to continue as the CW's official Saturday morning block. Because of that, along with the anime's decline in ratings and a renewed focus on creating more original shows from Warner Bros. Animation, the show would officially end its 7-year run on the block, with the final new episode, Pasta La Vista, premiering on July 8, 2006, though the show would continue to play in reruns until September 16th. Fortunately though, the anime had found a second home on Cartoon Network, which had been airing reruns of the show beginning in 2002, and would officially premiere the 9th season, Pokémon Battle Frontier, 2 months later on September 8th, where it would go on to premiere every new season on Cartoon Network for the next decade until their broadcast rights expired in 2016. Then, it would be picked up by Disney XD for 4 years, and would then later be acquired by Netflix, where it continues releasing new episodes to this day. As for Kids WB, the block would continue for 2 more seasons on the CW, making it the only network kids block to outlive the network it was created for. But it was never the same after Pokémon left. Mind you, it wasn't that the new shows they had were terrible, it just didn't have the same spark and energy that made it the must-watch Saturday morning block it was for 9 years. After it moved to the CW, the block stopped airing anime altogether after 2007, and a majority of their newer acquired shows came from Canada, specifically the ones produced and co-produced by Cookie Jar Entertainment, and one show, Eon Kid, that came from South Korea. But most of them never caught on the same way, and coupled with many of their newer shows underperforming, Kids WB would officially end its 12-year-long run on May 17, 2008, and would then be succeeded by the CW4 Kids the next week. While it was sad the block had an unceremonious end, it was pretty clear the block was on its last legs by 2008, and the time was right to finally end it. But even despite that, the block would forever remain as a large part of Pokémon's history, as its impact left a lasting impression with those that first laid eyes on it that fateful day on February 13, 1999. All in all, Pokémon's time on Kids WB was a very impactful and significant one. While its success may have come at the expense of some of their other shows, overall it brought a lot of massive popularity to both the show and the blog, helped give anime as a whole some significant mainstream attention, and helped turn Kids WB into one of the biggest Saturday morning hotspots for several years. Even long after its final episode premiered on the blog, Many people and fans today still fondly remember all of the fun times they had catching the anime during its heyday on the block. I hope you guys had a great time watching and that it gave you a good insight into the anime's importance in Kids WB's history. And if you want to see more, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and leave a like on the video. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, head on over to patreon.com/medianutso, where if you pledge just $3 a month, you'll gain access to new videos and Pokemon art pieces a full 2 days before they go public and other exclusive perks. With all that said, what was the first episode of Pokemon you remember seeing on Kids WB, and how did you feel when the show left the block? Be sure to comment your thoughts down below. Until next time, this is Medianutso saying thank you all very much, and I'll see you on the next one.